Hello everyone. In this video I hope to pass on what I have learned over the years about choosing the correct length of oars for your boat, whether it's a traditional rowboat, sailboat, raft, or any other watercraft that one wants to fit out with a new set of oars. If you're in the process of buying or making a set of oars, then this video is for you. We will look at the different parameters of both your boat and your body size that should be considered when choosing a set of oars. I will be helped by my rowing buddy, Boney. Here he comes now. So that we are all on the same page, let us develop the nomenclature of rowing. First, let's look at the oars themselves.
The outboard end of oars is some form of blade, while the inboard end is some form of handle. Connecting the two ends is the loom. The loom can also take on several geometries, and it is the part of the oar that is adjusted to create the wanted overall length. The loom is divided into an inboard section and an outboard section, defined by the pivot point. The pivot point is where some form of oarlock holds the oar to the gunwale. In some configurations, it sits just outboard of a collar and is often protected from chafe by leather. Another important point on the oars is its center of gravity. It should lie just a few inches outboard of the pivot point.
The function of an oar, of course, is to propel the boat. It acts as a form of lever and, in a sense, pries the boat into motion. The fulcrum of the lever is at the blade, which is anchored in the water. The load is the boat itself, positioned at the pivot, and the input force, our arms, is positioned at the handle.
It works much like a wheelbarrow, but instead of working against gravity in a vertical direction, our oars work against drag in a more or less horizontal direction.
To further illustrate this concept, I have drawn a simple lever and labeled it with the parameters of our oar. Think of looking down on the oar from above when it's in a position that is perpendicular to the boat's keel. The right end of the oar/lever is the effective center of the blade. It is held by the water, and though there is always some slippage, it acts essentially as a fulcrum. The blade pushes backwards on the water. At the other end of the oar is the center of the handle. The handle also pushes backwards, but on the oar's hand. These two forces are balanced by the oar pushing forward on the oarlock with an equal and opposite force. The strengths of these three forces are related to each other by Archimedes' lever law.
The formula adopted for our situation is as follows. The force on the hand times the effective length of the oar is equal to the force on the boat at the oarlock times the effective length of the outer loom. The rowing community makes use of a concept called gearing. Think of a bicycler switching gears to affect the pressure needed on his pedals. For oars, gearing is defined as the outer effective loom length divided by the inner effective loom length. An oar's gearing has many uses, as we shall see later. I have modified our force equation by replacing the different oar lengths with gearing, giving us a very insightful version. Note that the force driving the boat B does not depend on the oar length. It only depends on the input force at the handle and the gearing. In other words, a 10-foot oar and a 6-foot oar that have the same gearing and have the same input forces at the handle will push the boat with equal force. Here are several oars that have a gearing of 2, that is, the outer effective loom length is twice the inner effective loom length. If I choose any of these oars, the mechanical advantage will be the same. However, as you might have anticipated, there is more to the story.
There are two additional properties of oars that will narrow our choice of oar length. The first has to do with how our driving forces pushes the boat. Here is a snapshot of our rower at the finish of his stroke. Note that the driving force B in our previous formulas in colored black in this snapshot is directed as always perpendicular to the oar. However, in this case, and actually in all other cases where the oar is not perpendicular to the keel, a portion of our force, here colored red, is working to push the boat sideways. The force pushing the boat forward, here colored green, is diminished as a result. The resulting useful force, colored green, is the produced force, black, multiplied by the sine of the angle the oar makes with the keel. For example, when the oar is at 90 degrees to the keel, the useful force is the same as the produced force because the sine of 90 degrees is 1. However, if, as in this example, the oar makes a smaller angle with the keel, say 60 degrees, then the useful force is reduced to roughly 7/10 of the produced force, because the sine of 60 degrees is 0.707. By the way, the red force does not actually move the boat sideways because the other oar balances out this effect by pushing in the opposite direction. An important property of the sine function that it is very close to the value of 1 when within 10 degrees of 90, meaning that in this range of oar rotation, the effective green force is nearly the same as the produced force. As a result, our rowing is most efficient if we can keep our oars angled to the keel greater than 80 degrees, or another way of putting it, within 10 degrees of being perpendicular to the keel. We will come back to this concept in a minute. Based on size and flexibility, each rower will have their own optimum pulling distance, that is, the 4F distance that the handle travels between the catch and the finish. In this diagram, I have chosen 3 feet as the pulling distance, a reasonable length for most rowers without sliding seats. This distance is represented by the 2 white horizontal lines. 2 oars with the same gearing but with different lengths are shown at the catch point and the finish point. Note that, though the handles of both sets travel the same distance, the blades do not. Also note that the angle through which the short oar travels is larger than the angle through which the long oar travels. Since, based on our previous discussion, larger angles are to be avoided, we can come to the first of our rules, namely, for any given gearing, choose the longest oar that still fits the other human and boat parameters. Speaking of which, let us now examine the human parameters that must be considered when sizing the oars. We examine the parameters of the rower and the boat for 2 reasons. First, we need to use the parameters to help us choose the appropriate oar gearing. Once the gearing is narrowed down, we need to use the geometric parameters of the boat and the rower to choose the correct oar length. Every boat, whether a sleek rowing shell or a log raft, has built into its shape intrinsic drag coefficients that ultimately determine the force it takes to move it. Other things being equal, long boats move through the water easier than short boats. Likewise, narrow shapes move through the water easier than wide ones, and complicated and/or rough shapes move through the water slower than fair and polished shapes. Again, other things being equal. The best way to get a feel of the amount of drag your boat has is on the water rowing it. See how fast it moves when you row at various levels of energy output. I use my phone's GPS to determine the boat's speed and a heart monitor to measure my power output. If the pressure exerted on the oar handles seems light for your physical ability, and/or the stroke rate seems higher than necessary, then the oars that you're using have too low a gearing for your boat. If, on the other hand, the pressure on the oar handle seems excessive, and/or the stroke rate is lower than, say, 12 strokes a minute, the gearing of the oars that you're using is too high. Don't worry about ergonomic efficiency at this stage. These considerations will come later. If available, try a set of oars with different gearing. Some oars allow one to move the pivot point inboard or outboard to change the gearing, allowing for experimentation. If you will be rowing in open waters, consider rowing against expected winds where lower gearing will be more comfortable. A typical gearing for normal-sized people rowing a typical rowboat is around 2.5, but can vary considerably. Once you are pleased with the gearing, measure the inboard and outboard effective looms and calculate the desired gearing by dividing the effective outboard loom by the effective inboard loom. Note, the effective length of the outboard section of the oar is the sum of the outboard loom and half the blade length. The effective length of the inboard section of the oar is the sum of the inboard loom and half the handle length. This is the gearing that we'll be using later. Next, we will measure the ideal effective inboard section of the oar, the length of which will be used to calculate our final oar length. While sitting in your boat, measure the length of your pulling distance and then reposition your body on the seat so that when the oar is perpendicular to the keel, you are at the halfway point of the stroke. An assistant with a ruler makes this measurement much easier. Next, with your body sitting in the position found in the previous step, swing the oar to the finished position with your trunk leaning slightly back, whatever is comfortable. Your hand should be comfortably near the sides of your chest at the height somewhere near the bottom of your rib cage. Again, your preference. If your oar is too short or long, free it at the oar locks, or if this is not possible, just use a broom handle in its place. Take your time to get this position right because it's important. When rowing with your new oars, muscle memory will allow you to position the blade correctly without much difficulty except at the finish, where in close quarters your arms can lose ergonomic efficiency when only slightly out of the optimum position. Now have your assistant measure the horizontal distance between the oar pivot point and the middle of your hand. A level held vertical at the center of your hand makes this measurement easier. The geometric position of your hand we will call the key point, and the projected horizontal distance from it to the pivot point we will call the projected effective inner loom radius. If an assistant is not available, or just to check your work, the projected effective inner loom radius can be calculated as follows. A right triangle can be drawn on a horizontal plane passing through the oar lock. Then we can use Pythagoras' theorem on this triangle to calculate the projected effective inner loom length. In order to do this calculation, we will need one measurement from the boat and two measurements from the rower. These are the distance separating the oar locks, the distance between the centers of the hands when at the finish position, and the pull distance, again, the fore-aft distance the hands travel between the catch and the finish of the stroke. We will use this form of Pythagoras' formula since we are trying to find C, the length of the projected effective inner loom. A in the triangle is equal to 1/2 the pulling distance. B is calculated by subtracting the hand separation from the oar lock separation and then dividing that difference by 2. Then to calculate C using the formula, we square both A and B, add the results together, and then take the square root of the sum. To drive this home, let's do an example. Let's say that the oar lock separation is 5 feet, the hand separation is 1.5 feet, and the pulling distance is 3 feet. Then A in our formula is 3 feet divided by 2 equals 1.5 feet. So A squared is equal to 2.25. B in our formula is equal to 5 minus 1.5 divided by 2 equals 1.75. So B squared is equal to 3.05 feet. Adding A squared and B squared, we get 5.3, and taking the square root of that, we get 2.3 feet. Thus, the calculated projected effective inner loom length is 2.3 feet. We will use this distance as we proceed. When the rower pulls the oar through its power stroke, the blade is kept at the same depth in the water throughout the full stroke. Assuming that the boat is not rocking, this implies that the handle must travel along a circular arc in a horizontal plane at a constant height above the water. We know from our previous discussion that the key point is at the aft end of this arc. Therefore, the height of the handle above the waterline throughout the stroke is equal to the height of the key point above the waterline. This height depends on 3 factors: the height of the oar lock above the water, the distance the seat is below the oar lock, and the distance the hand at the key point is above the seat. Therefore, the hand height above the water, that is the key point, is equal to the height of the oarlocks above the waterline minus the distance the seat is below the oarlocks, and then plus the distance between the rower's hand and the seat, a distance that necessarily depends on the rower's posture and size. We see that the first two measurements depend on the boat's design and buoyancy, while the last distance depends on the rower's build. Rowers of the same boat using the same hand separation at the key point, but of different vertical stature, or with the same stature but sitting on a seat cushion, will therefore produce a power arc with different distances above the waterline. Let us continue with our previous example. A boat has a freeboard of 1.5 feet, or seat depth of 1/2 foot, and the seat to key point torso length of 1 3/4 feet. So the key point height above the waterline is 1.5 minus 0.5 plus 1.75, or 2.75 feet. We'll use this information along with the 2.3 feet calculated earlier in our plot to determine our oar length and gearing. The diagram we are looking at is a cross-section of our boat at the fore-aft position of the oarlocks. The horizontal blue line represents the waterline from which all vertical measurements are taken. The red vertical line is drawn at a distance inboard from the oarlocks equal to the projected effective inner loom length, as calculated earlier to be 2.3 feet. The X positioned on this line represents the position of the handle when the oar is perpendicular to the keel, the height above the water being the height of the key point calculated earlier as 2.75 feet. Our discussions to this point have been included to convince the audience that this point is not arbitrary. It is determined by the fixed measurements of the boat and rower. A second X is located at the oarlocks. These points form a straight line that coincides with the position of the oar. If we extend this line outboard, it will intersect the waterline at the position where the outer loom joins the oar blade. I have overlain this line with an oar of appropriate size, and we can now measure its parts. To begin, let's look at the parts of the oar whose lengths are fixed by the geometry. First, let's measure the effective inner loom, which is made up of the inner loom plus the outboard portion of the handle, the length of which is 1/2 the rower's grip width. The effective inner loom length is equal to the distance between the two X's in our cross-section. Since it has been shown that the position of the X's are fixed, the distance separating them, i.e. the effective inner loom length, is also a fixed length. In our example, that effective inner loom measures 2.4 feet. The inner loom is just the effective inner loom without the portion of the handle outboard of the center of the rower's hand, and as a consequence is also fixed in length. It is often thickened inboard as a way to shift the center of gravity inboard. In our example, the inner loom measures 2.2 feet. The other part of the oar which geometrically has a fixed length is the outer loom, that is, the distance between the oarlock to the beginning of the blade. That distance is of fixed length as a consequence of the oar being straight through its length. It, the waterline, and a vertical line through the oarlock form a right triangle. Since two angles, the 90-degree angle between the waterline and the vertical, and the angle of the slope of the oar at the oarlock are fixed, and the vertical line between them is fixed, then by the rules of trigonometry, the outer loom length is also fixed. In our example, the outer loom measures 3.6 feet. The remaining parts of the oar are not constrained by the geometry of the boat or rower, therefore they can be made shorter or longer, though excessive changes in length from the proven norms is counterproductive. The handle can be of any reasonable length, but should be at least slightly longer than the width of the rower's hand. Lengthening the handle will, in some instances, allow the rower to hold both oars with one hand, freeing the second hand for other functions. A longer handle will also shift the center of gravity inboard, especially if it has a weighted core. Note, any added length does not change the oar's gearing. For our example, I chose a length of just under 6 inches. The blade, like the handle, can vary in length, but an abnormally short blade will allow excessive slippage, while an abnormally long blade will both add rotational drag and move the center of gravity further outboard. Since the inboard half of the blade is part of the effective outer loom, changes in the blade length will have an effect on the oar's gearing, but any appreciably beneficial change in gearing comes at a cost of loss in performance. There are better ways to change the oar's gearing. In our example, I chose the blade length to be 1.4 feet. The effective outer loom length, since it is made up of the fixed length outer loom plus the inboard half of the blade, is technically not a fixed length because the blade length can be changed. Because I chose the blade length to be 1.4 feet, the effective outer loom length is 4.25 feet. The total length of the oar in our example is the sum of the physical parts of the oar: the lengths of the blade, the outer loom, the inner loom, and the handle. For our example, the oar length is 7.75 feet. The gearing of our example oar, the effective outer loom length divided by the effective inner loom length, is 4.25 divided by 2.4, or 1.75. So what conclusions can we draw from all this? We have seen that for any given gearing, long oars are better. We have seen that if ergonomic efficiency is the goal, for any given boat-rower combination, essentially only one oar length fits the bill, and its gearing, whatever it is, comes with the package. I don't know about you, but these facts I find rather astounding. I would have hoped that I could go to the store and buy a set of oars of the length and gearing I wished and row away contently. What to do? The boat and human parameters dictate the oar length and, more importantly, the oar gearing. So, unless the rower wants to suffer through serious reconstructive surgery, we are forced to modify our boat in such a way as to achieve the gearing and/or length wished for. I wish there was a simple formula that would allow us to calculate the length of the oar with the gearing we desired. I have found that it is much easier to find the answer graphically. In order to do this, we will need to use 6 measurements taken from the boat and the rower's geometry, the same measurements that we discussed earlier. For our graph, we will use the units of centimeters. We need the height of the oarlock above the waterline. We will label this distance F on the graph for freeboard. For our example, we will give our boat a freeboard of 50 centimeters. The distance of the seat below F, or the freeboard, we will label this distance S on the graph for seat. We will say our boat seat sit down is 15 centimeters. The vertical distance from the seat to the rower's hand, when the hand is in the desired position at the finish of the power stroke. We will label this distance T on the graph for torso. We will give our rower a torso of 30 centimeters. The length of the pulling distance used by the rower during the power stroke. We will call this distance P for pulling, and we'll give, in this example, our rower a pulling distance of 90 centimeters. The distance between the oarlocks. We will call this distance W for oarlock width. We'll give our boat a width of 150 centimeters. And finally, the distance between the centers of the hands at the finish point. We'll call this distance C for chest. We'll say our rower has a chest of 45 centimeters. Our graph will require the length of the projected effective inner loom. Remember, we used Pythagoras' formula for this. Here's the formula with our values inserted and the results. So the projected effective inner loom will be 69 centimeters. We will develop our graph by first drawing in fixed points based on the data for our example. We first draw a horizontal line that represents the waterline. From this waterline, we draw a perpendicular at any location. On it, we place the oarlock at the distance f above the waterline, marking it with an X. We next measure inboard to the left from our viewpoint the distance of the projected effective inner loom, found to be, in our case, 69 centimeters. At that point, we construct another perpendicular and measure up the calculated key point height, remembering that the key point height is equal to F minus S plus T, or in our case, 50 minus 15 plus 30, resulting in a height of 65 centimeters. We place an X at the key point. Our foundation graph is now ready for use. Let's first draw a straight line through the X's extended to the waterline to determine the length and gearing of our unaltered boat. Let's use a 60 centimeter blade and a 15 centimeter handle. Following the steps previously explained, we get an oar length of 372 centimeters and a gearing of 3.7. Let's assume that the rower, based on his experience with this boat, would prefer a gearing ratio of 3 instead of 3.7. We will use our graph to do this, but first let's create a template to make this step easier. On a sheet of transparent paper or vellum, using the same scale as our graph, construct the following. Draw a vertical line of approximately 10 meters. Near the top, draw a horizontal line of length longer than your expected oar length. I chose 4 meters. And adjust its inboard-outboard position to produce the desired gearing ratio, in this case, 3. Doing this, the line on the left representing the effective inner loom is of length 1 meter, and the line to the right representing the effective outer loom is of length 3 meters, adding up to 4 meters and giving the gearing of 3 divided by 1, or 3. Next, measure down the vertical line. We'll call this the pivot point line, some multiple of 0.5 meters. I measured down 7.5 meters, marking the line at each of the 0.5 meter marks. On the lowest mark, construct another horizontal line, making its length shorter than the expected oar length. I chose 2 meters. To determine the effective inner loom length, use the gearing definition and solve for effective inner loom length using an oar length of 2 meters and a gearing of 3. So for the bottom line, the effective inner loom is 0.5 meters and the effective outer loom is 1.5 meters. Next, connect the respective ends of the horizontal lines. The inboard line we'll call the key point line, and the outboard line runs through the outer ends of the effective outer loom. Then at each of the marks made on the vertical pivot point line, draw a horizontal line extending from the key point line to the outer loom line. Finally, measure inboard 0.3 meters, half the blade length, from the outer end of one or more horizontal lines so that you can draw a line parallel to the outer line but moved inboard 0.3 meters. This line we'll call the water line. I have erased the outer line to rid the template of clutter. The template represents all the possible oar lengths in the range we chose that have the gearing we specified. Any one of them would work if we were willing to modify the locations of both the key point and the oarlock. However, from a practical point of view, our choices are more restrictive. In most cases, the boat seat cannot be readily lowered, but on the other hand, it can be easily raised many centimeters by adding padding or other lifting devices. As a consequence, it is difficult to lower the key point but easier to raise it. As we will see, modifying the key point height to a higher position is the most practical way to lower gearing. Likewise, the oarlock position would be difficult to lower because the boat's hull is in the way, but by using lifting blocks and or outriggers, the oarlock height F,
or freeboard can be raised as much as necessary. If one wants to increase the gearing, the most practical way to do so is raising the freeboard. The use of outriggers can be used to increase the oar length without changing gearing, but because of their vulnerability in rough waters, are not really recommended. If we try to find an oarlock with higher gearing, we use our template as follows. We choose any horizontal line of our template and place the point of crossing of it with the key point line on top of the key point X on the graph. This is the point of rotation we will rotate the template around. The chosen horizontal line also crosses the water line. We rotate the template until this crossing aligns itself with the water line on the graph. Here is an animation that shows this process. To see if we chose the correct horizontal line, we'll look to see where the crossing of the chosen horizontal line and the oarlock line lies relative to the oarlock X on the graph. If it is outboard, we must choose a shorter horizontal line. If it is inboard, we choose a longer horizontal line. We proceed until we find a horizontal line on our template that falls vertically above the oarlock X on the graph. That line will be the one we use to calculate the oar length. If we are trying to find an oar with lower gearing, we use our template as follows. We choose any horizontal line of our template and place the point where it crosses the oarlock line on top of the oarlock X in the graph. This is our point of rotation. The chosen horizontal line also crosses the water line on the template. We rotate the template until the waterline crossing on the template aligns with the waterline on the graph. This animation shows the process. When the template is rotated into the correct position, we check the location of the crossing of the chosen horizontal line with the key point line of the template. If this crossing lies inboard of the key point X on the graph, we choose a shorter horizontal line. If the crossing lies outboard of the key point X, we choose a longer horizontal line and repeat the process until a keystone crossing lies on the keystone line of our graph. That chosen line will be the one we use to calculate the oar length. In either of the above cases, we find the total oar length by adding the uncounted portions of the blade and handle to the length of the chosen horizontal line. For our example, because we're finding an oar length with lower gearing, we will follow the latter method.
Here our template is in position. We find the length of the horizontal line that fits our graph is 282 centimeters. We add 30 centimeters for the part of the blade outboard of the effective outer loom and 7 centimeters for the length of the handle inboard of the effective inner loom. That makes the length of our oar with a gearing of 3 to be 319 centimeters. We find from our graph that we need to raise the seat by 6 centimeters. Out of curiosity, how does this oar length compare with industry standards? Many outlets take 1/2 the beam width, add 5, and then multiply the result by 25/7. For our boat, with a beam of 150 centimeters, we get 75 plus 5 or 80, and 80 multiplied by 25/7 gives us 286 centimeters. Those oars would be lower gearing and require our rower to sit considerably higher. Well, I hope this video has been helpful. Until next time, keep rowing.